Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about how spiritual awakening isn't a glamorous process and how it's not all love and light. And to be honest, sometimes it can be hard AF. And I obviously would say that the full words, but being on YouTube, I think it's better to not risk better to not risk swearing. So I think you all know what I mean when I say it's hard AF. It's definitely not, a love and light process because, there's a lot of inner demolition that goes on with spiritual awakening. It's essentially an ego death. And if that sounds painful, it's because it is, you know. And I think that a lot of people find themselves on the spiritual awakening path not out of conscious choice, but because they've been through a significant event in their life, they've experienced significant trauma, they've been the victim of a really big betrayal, and whatever has happened in their life has been significant enough to initiate a spiritual awakening journey. The inner demolition that the majority of people really just don't sign up to on a willing basis. It's not like a yoga class where you pay $10 to have your inner psyche purged, all the wounds, illusions, and fears and trauma that you're holding in your body to be purged, because it's not an easy process. And I think one of the main things that doesn't get talked about is that awakening forces you to see other people in your life very clearly, and yourself first and foremost. You have to be really honest with yourself about your own blocks, your fears, your wounds, your shadow. And then as you start to do your own healing work and you start to heal those parts of yourself and take responsibility for them and integrate them into your life, you start to then have a sensitivity to seeing these things in people around you. You start to be able to see where their wounds are, their unhealed, unexamined shadow selves. And it might manifest in the form of manipulations or projections, or just a repeated pattern of behavior that's very destructive, like addictions, things like that. And it gets to the point sometimes with people in your life who you've known for a very long time. Maybe it's a partner, maybe it's your parents, maybe it's a good friend, or, somebody else that you love very dearly. And then you are actively doing your work and you're ascending further and further, and you're making more and more room for all the good stuff to flow in because you've actively worked on releasing all of those parts that are no longer helpful for you, as they say in the spiritual community, no longer serving you. And you can really see where other people are perhaps maybe outright refusing to look at themselves, that maybe they don't have the capacity to self-reflect. Maybe they are actually at a much more dangerous level and they are narcissistic, or they're a narcissist, and they are actively not only refusing to self-reflect but projecting that onto you and manipulating you and blame shifting onto you. But it can really just happen in terms of a relatively safe relationship. Maybe your partner of many years hasn't been doing any shadow work, hasn't been doing any psychological or emotional healing. They aren't on a spiritual journey, yet you are. And it creates a scenario where you start to actually drift further and further apart. Spiritual awakening can have a big, massive effect on marriages, friendship, work relationships, anyone, any really close relationship that you have, when both parties or all parties aren't actually doing that work. And you might find yourself in a cycle with, one of these people, say, again, your partner of many years, where it doesn't matter how many times you try to, with empathy and compassion, talk to them and say, hey, I really need you to look at this, or I think there might be some unhealed parts of you, and can we really work on this together? Or I'm here for you, but I can't do the work for you. No matter how many times you try and point that out, perhaps they're refusing to look at it, and you just end up in a stalemate all the time. And it kind of gets to the point where you're not only disconnected and not seeing eye to eye, but you're actually an energetic mismatch. You're no longer in alignment with each other. You're actually on different levels completely. And it's at that point that it's really heartbreaking often, because you kind of can't really keep moving forward on your path, keep growing, keep moving towards your mission and your goals when you're engaging in these really dysfunctional cycles or karmic cycles with the people that are closest to you. And it's at that point that people become really distressed and unstuck, or not unstuck, rather the opposite. They start to feel really stuck. They start to feel at a crossroads, because it's like, I've done all this work on myself, and I don't want to accept really bad treatment, or, just a dynamic where it's one-sided and, my partner or whoever it is not able to self-reflect and take responsibility. And so we just keep circling the same thing over and over again. And it's very distressing and distracting, and it's having all sorts of health implications for me. I don't want to end up back in that, but at the same time, I don't want to lose this person who's been such a huge part of my life and I feel comfortable with, or I at least used to feel very comfortable with. And so it's a very hard place to be. It can be a specific kind of grief that accompanies that. And I think that, for a lot of us on the spiritual path, that doesn't just happen with partners and, say, close friends or colleagues. It often happens with our parents too, that they can't actually self-reflect. They're carrying maybe a lot of intergenerational trauma themselves that they've never actually sought any help around. They've never been to see a counselor. They've never ever done any shadow work. They're not willing to look at it. They're not willing to even admit that it's there, or they don't even have the capacity to self-reflect, or maybe they're even downright sort of abusive, which is, I guess, the more difficult, dysfunctional end of the spectrum. And that can be ultimately probably the most heartbreaking part of this journey, is realizing that your parents don't, or maybe one parent doesn't have the capacity to give you what you've always needed. And once you're an adult, you can't really sort of expect that. When you're a child, you're completely dependent on your parents. And, it makes sense from a survival perspective to see your parents as these godlike figures who, have all the answers, and that they'll always be there, and you always turn to them, and their wisdom is great, and all of those things. But as an adult, especially when you're on the spiritual awakening path and you start to see that, perhaps they're limited, and you have to stop looking at them through those eyes, through the eyes of a child, that's dependent. You have to accept where they're at. And, you have to also grieve the fact that they can't be, or they can't give you what you've needed your entire life. So that's a very difficult type of grief. And I've been through that myself, so I know firsthand, just in my own journey, with my own circumstances, just how confronting and difficult that stage is, or just confronting that my parents were never able to actually give me what I needed, and that's ultimately okay. And you can be angry and you can feel that, but ultimately it's about accepting the fact that that's how it is and that's okay, and we can heal that wound and we can move forward, and we can't expect other people to do the work if they don't want to, if that's not where they're at, if that's not their values, if they don't see there's any point in it. I think that's a very freeing place to be, even though it can be incredibly painful. And so, apart from parents, I think the other type of spiritual awakening that happens for a lot of people, especially empaths, and it's often quite violent, is a spiritual awakening through a narcissistic relationship. And again, if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that that was my story. I mean, I haven't gone into it in a lot of depth, but essentially that's what happened to me. I met somebody who I thought was a soulmate, and we felt so aligned and it was magical, and they felt like, a soul connection, all those things. And then there was a devastating breakup and a betrayal. And a friend of mine, or more an acquaintance really, said, "Oh, I think that person was probably your twin flame." And down the rabbit hole I went. Ended up in the twin flame cult. And so that was a very violent and very abrupt, blindsiding awakening that I experienced back then. And it was certainly not something that I anticipated or I chose. It was something that I was just kind of shaken into through this very, very debilitating, traumatizing circumstances that brought up all of my wounds and kind of forced a spiritual awakening to happen. So, I think that's another very unique type of situation where a spiritual awakening can be experienced. And again, that's usually, in fact, I'd say 99.9%, if not 100% of the time, is not chosen. It's not something that you would actively put yourself forward for, oh, hey, I want to meet someone who I felt was the love of my life and is this amazing connection, and turned it out to be someone whose psyche was very, very disordered and was very dangerous and very psychologically unsafe. And then I'm going to experience, a Kundalini awakening as a result, and all of my wounds and fears and illusions and childhood trauma is going to be brought up to the surface so I can heal and purge it over a number of years. Yeah, I don't think that's something that a lot of people would go, yeah, yes, thank you. Yep, me, thanks. I'll do that. Yep, I'm ready and willing to do that straight away. Yes, give it to me. So all of this is to say that the awakening journey, as I said at the start of the video, is hard AF. It's very challenging. It's not something that is for the faint-hearted, but it is incredibly sacred. It's a sacred journey, and it changes everything. It really does. It changes your entire life. And if you can keep moving forward past this point where you're struggling to let go of people in your life who you thought were always going to be there and have been a big part of your story, but now you're at a crossroads. Now you're at a point where you're no longer an energetic match anymore. If you can keep moving forward towards your own mission, your goals, and leave those people behind, at least energetically, then it's a very powerful thing to do, because you're breaking free of karmic patterns. You're breaking free of things like victim mindsets and generational trauma to do with a lack mindset and poverty consciousness and in damaging, difficult, emotionally and psychologically abusive relationships, which, that's a large part of a lot of people's generational trauma background, that it's been passed down to them, that it's happened for their parents and their parents' parents, this sort of template that where you always end up being taken advantage, victimized, abused by a narcissist or somebody, who's very, very toxic. And so by letting go of those very toxic dynamics and choosing you and moving forward, even if it's really, really hard and very confronting and very difficult and by no means comfortable in any way, you are doing humanity and yourself and your family line a huge, huge service, and it's incredibly powerful. You can actually break the chains of all of those toxic cycles and patterns for you, your family lineage, for your children if you have them. And then you can also help educate other people and help other people how to do it, because there's a lot of very lost and confused and distressed people out there experiencing these sort of things and not knowing what's going on or what to do about it or how to move forward. So if you can do it yourself and then help to educate other people, help other people to crawl out of those very difficult spaces, that's incredibly powerful. And it's the ultimate gift, really, to yourself, to them, to the collective. And it's the ultimate journey and mission of a human being on this planet. Well, that's what I think anyway. And I think a lot of people ultimately share that sentiment. So with that, I might leave it there for today. And thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that it was helpful in some way. And I'll be back soon with another juicy video. Okay.